Chilling tales for dark nights.
The Mourner. Written by Gareth Shaw. Performed by Alicia Pavlis. Featuring David Lewis Richardson and Peter Bishop. Audio production and music by Jeff Clement. With their black clothing and hats jeweled by the combined moistures of drizzle and fog, the huddled mourners looked beautiful through the zoom lens. Katie panned the camera across the throng to better admire the perfection of the scene. Long overcoats, sleek shirts, heels stabbing into the grass, banded Homburgs, even a scattering of spiderwebbed veils, all spoke of the wealth and power gathered round the open grave, like Hollywood's idea of the perfect somber funeral. The fog swirled, gravestones leaned in the foreground, and the limp branches of a willow provided a sway of green backdrop so that the mourners were like black opals lying against a jeweler's felt. The camera clicked and froze the image forever. Excellent. A fine picture, all would agree, but not good enough for Katie right then. Not when she could sense perfection hovering within reach. She waited for the final detail to slot into place and create the shot, the one guaranteed to accompany that month's feature article. All that stood, literally between Katie and her big breakthrough, was a thin man in what looked to be an ill-fitting suit, his sloping shoulders narrow but just wide enough to obscure the star of the show and many others. The recently widowed Felicity Royal. Her wide hat haloed the man's head in black, but her face was hidden. "Come on, move," she urged him through gritted teeth, shifting as the damp grass started to soak through her jeans. Like a suddenly flourished handkerchief, the priest stepped out of the throng and stood looking into the grave to the left of the shot, his bright white robes contrasting perfectly with the gloominess of the falling light. He started to speak. Katie could hear the drone, but not make out the words from her prone position behind a manicured hedge, and the mourners' heads bowed as one. "Shit, this is it, move your ass," she hissed at the thin man. A woman's head dropped onto the shoulder of her companion. "Come on, for God's sake." The priest's hands clasped a blood-red Bible to his chest. All she could think was, not quite the one, not quite the one, not quite the one. Never before had she wished anyone dead, truly and sincerely and horribly dead, but she wished a whole range of grisly fates on that thin man right then. Each passing second, each click of the camera meant the chance, this glorious, possibly once-in-a-career chance, was slipping away, all thanks to some skinny bastard in an overpriced suit. Katie hissed through her nostrils as the priest's words ended. Several of the throng shifted slightly, about to lift their heads. She screamed silently behind the shrubbery, wrestling with her fury to keep the camera still. Damn it. Then it happened. The skinny man stepped to his right, just one step, to pat someone on the elbow, and suddenly, the widow herself, Felicity Royal, a mascara-streaked crimson lipstick version of the Felicity Royal who had graced televisions the country over for years, glanced up at the overcast heavens, her ashen face emerging like a beacon from under her hat, whilst those around her still gloomed at the sodden ground. The chief editor beamed and thumped his desk.
"Now that,"
he boomed, jabbing a finger at the laptop screen in front of him,
"is 15 karat solid gold."
Katie smiled the modest smile she had practiced in the mirror a couple of hours ago when the summons to the office of Peep had come through. The fact that the magazine had been in touch mere minutes after she emailed the photo confirmed the feeling that had tingled through her since she had captured the perfect shot at the cemetery. This was it. Peep's chief editor spun the laptop round to her, and Katie's modesty crumbled in the glow of her photograph on the screen. A shadowy, somber masterpiece etched out in pin-sharp high resolution.
Own up right now, Catherine.
The editor almost shouted and Katie flinched, the grin dying on her face.
Come on, you bloody paid those people to pose, didn't you? Couldn't be better if you'd told them where to stand.
She breathed in relief and adjusted her skirt over her knees. Just in the right place at the right time, I suppose. The editor sat back, pulling the laptop back towards him, eyes on the screen, and laughed.
You make that sound like luck. That's the trick of your job, isn't it?
Katie watched his eyes flicker around the image, seeing how they constantly came back to the pale, upward-turned face of Felicity Royal, and knew with a flush of heat that thousands would soon do the same thing when they saw the front cover of Peep on the shelves in a month's time.
Bloody hell. The composition is perfect.
The editor continued in a more hushed voice, as if seeing the photograph for the first time.
The mourners, the trees, the gravestones.
He paused for a breath.
And her. Beautiful and sad and lost, all at the same time. The punters are going to lap it up.
Looking at the back of the laptop's lid, Katie remembered the widow in that one moment and the raw, naked pain on Felicity Royal's face that had never been seen on a television screen. A pain that the public was soon to hungrily drink in. For the first time, she felt the faintest needle prick of guilt. But then the editor lowered the screen and the talk turned to money and royalties and an extended contract. The meeting ended quickly with promises of being in touch soon and a brisk handshake.
Oh, Catherine.
The editor stopped her before she closed the door.
Unfortunately, there's no such thing as perfection, you know.
She frowned in puzzlement.
We'll have to airbrush the weirdo out. He spoils the mood a bit. No big deal. Speak to you on Tuesday.
Katie, still frowning, clicked the door shut with hot hands and hurried to the lift, already reaching for the tablet in her bag. Weirdo. She shakily opened the photo file and peered at the image she thought she knew so well. What had the editor said? He spoils the mood a bit. He. Katie scanned the mourners, seeing them all anew. They were actually people now, not glamorous funeral mannequins. Their faces contorted or slackened or rigid with genuine grief. She picked out the men, all holding onto female hands or arms or shoulders. All except one. A thin man, the one who had moved just in time, stood turned to the side, and he stood alone. His face was lined and angular in profile, his eye hidden in the shadow of a deep socket that made him appear to be in his 50s at least. In a black suit that, now Katie looked more closely, wasn't particularly expensive. His gaunt face bowed to the open grave and hands clasped. He looked every inch the mourner, apart from the fact that he was grinning. The wrought iron cemetery gates loomed grandly against a big sky of cloudless blue, inviting Katie inside onto a path that wound amongst the grass and gravestones. The sun made her squint, but curling leaves pooling in the lengthening shadows of tree trunks signaled the final days of summer, and she zipped up her jacket. In the distance, across the spiky, stony sweep of headstones, a high fence of iron spears and broad trees marked the section of the cemetery that was closed off to the ordinary members of the public. Further along the fence, there was a slight gap where she had squeezed through a few days ago. The private section was where Felicity Royal's husband was buried, where she had taken what promised to be a career-defining photograph, where a thin man had stood amongst a grieving crowd and smiled. The hollow indented eye socket, the laughter lines spiderwebbing from one corner of his eye, the long crease from cheek to clean-shaven chin, the pale, pale lips pursed in amusement, all magnified on Katie's laptop screen, had haunted her ever since. She couldn't get over the wrongness of his expression. Again and again she had peered at the faces of all the mourners, trying to spot one of them sharing the thin man's smile. She unconsciously capitalized him now, trying to see anything that might have sparked his humor. Their expressions varied slightly, but all were contorted in sadness. Perhaps the man was remembering some joke he'd shared with the deceased, or a happy memory. But somehow that didn't explain it. At first, the sneaky nature of the smile had convinced her the thin man was pleased that Mr. Royal was dead, and she began to contrive all sorts of plots and crimes that he might be guilty of. He was a jealous brother, a scheming business partner, a murderous family physician. She soon dismissed such soap opera thinking, but could not shift the conviction that he was guilty of something other than a severe lack of empathy or tact. A breath of wind edged with autumn ruffled Katie's hair, and she looked up to see that she had reached the end of the public section of the cemetery. The gate at the path's end was only slightly smaller than the main entrance, but padlocked, with opening times posted in a glass case and directions pointing to a porter's lodge. Here, the public gravestones were older, their edges rounded with names faded or mossed over. The air was damper and darker here, the sun screened by a thick green canopy of trees overhanging the private fence. But it was quiet and restful. Spurts of unkempt grass wavered in another gust as if waving goodbye to warmer seasons. The graves and verges nearer the main entrance were cleaner and trimmed and ordered, but Katie liked the sense of freedom and privacy here. She supposed that this distant corner would be pretty spooky at night, but in the September sunshine it was...
beautiful,
someone said. Katie yelped and spun around.
Isn't it?
The thin man asked, standing nearby, staring at her. Yes, Katie answered reflexively, taking a small step back, hand fluttering to her chest before she could stop it. Pale lips pursing, the thin man smiled. A smile that she knew so well, and the sight of it so close to her made her feel dizzy and unreal. He turned away and bent over to peer at a crumbling gravestone.
There's a bench there.
It took Katie a moment to focus on what he had just said.
Take a seat,
he said, rubbing some moss away from an inscription. His voice was soft and oddly comforting, like a granddad's voice. She looked around, saw the bench behind her and sat down, frowning at the tremble in her thighs. Get a grip of yourself, girl. Bloody hell. Look at the age of him. You could knock him over with one hand. Up close, Katie saw that he was a lot older than she had first thought. Perhaps in his 80s, judging by the veins showing through the papery skin on his knuckly hands. They didn't so much as quiver as he cleaned the headstone, however, and he moved with slow certainty, not even bending his knees to reach down. White hair swept back, covered his head, and rested like strands of cotton on his collar. The thin man's suit had once been expensive, she could tell by the cut, but had the stiff shininess of unwashed black worn too often. His trousers ended just above grey socks, adding to the slight air of shabbiness that hung about him. In her photograph, he had looked a lot more smart, a lot sharper. The suit wasn't right on him, she decided. It hung awkwardly about him, creasing and folding in the wrong places. He'd probably had it for years and had shrunk like old men do, age withering them into shadowy versions of their former selves. He was certainly thin. The padded suit shoulders drooped significantly, but he didn't seem fragile in the slightest.
That's better,
he said, flicking away the last bit of moss and standing upright. Katie squinted. He sort of rolled smoothly upright rather than jerkily straightening, as she expected. He saw her watching and placed a hand on his lower back while stretching extravagantly, his smile crooking into a grimace.
I should take it easy. These old bones grumble at me more and more each day.
Bloody charlatan. You're more limber than me, Katie thought, but smiled sympathetically. The thin man gestured to the bench, smiling again.
Mind if I take the weight off these achy legs?
Trying not to hesitate, Katie slid over and placed her handbag between them. She crossed her legs and pretended not to look as he sighed loudly down onto his seat. Again, despite the outward show of fragility, He seemed to flow into position. The bench didn't even creak as he settled his weight into place and neatly folded his hands in his lap. He too gazed out at the gravestone stretching out before them.
As I was saying, it's beautiful, isn't it?
All in that mellow granddad voice of his. It didn't seem reassuring now, though, right by her like someone speaking in an advert or narrating in a film. The thin man didn't speak loudly, but his words rumbled in her teeth and bones, like the bass was turned up too loudly. Also, old and thin as he was, he seemed to fill the space next to Katie, and she had to fight the urge to shift away from him. She nodded neutrally, wondering what about this old guy was raising the hairs on her arms.
I love this place at this time of year.
He paused and inhaled deeply through his nostrils.
A meeting of borders and the edges of things.
An arm swept out dramatically.
Here we are in a place where the living visit the dead. At a time when things stop growing and get ready to die away.
Leaning forward, so that he intruded into Katie's field of vision, he continued.
That grave there, for example.
She turned her head to see him pointing at the headstone he had been cleaning earlier.
Edna Bradbury found out she had cancer when she was 34, knew it was terminal, and made the most of her remaining time. Last 6 months of her life were the best, they said. To paraphrase the old line, the flame that burns half as long burns twice as bright. As I say, borders and edges. I remember her funeral well. Good turnout, big blue sky, like today. She was well loved.
Katie's unease was growing and her scalp started to prickle with sweat. She blurted out, "So, do you come here often then?" And winced. "Nice one, Katie girl. Now you're using one of the oldest chat-up lines in the book on an old man. Go get your walking stick, hotshot, you've pulled." The thin man didn't laugh or smile as she expected.
Oh, yes.
He let the hiss drift out into silence.
But then, you know I do. You've seen me here before, haven't you?
Caught off guard, she flushed and started to sputter something, anything. He had held up a long-fingered hand to stop her and laughed heartily. Like a television Santa, she thought wildly. Ho, 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 merry funeral.
Don't worry yourself, Katie. I'm not angry.
She sat bolt upright at the mention of her name. What is this?
Turns out we're a lot alike. Let me explain.
How does he know my name? As the thin man reached into a pocket inside his blazer, Katie, thoughts and questions whirling, looked around the cemetery and realized this section was empty. It seemed no one, well, nobody except the weirdo all-stars on this bench, came to this forgotten corner. Feeling confused and foolish and somehow cornered, her eyes traced along the path to the distant far entrance gates. Why don't I just get up and walk away? She wondered, and felt her thigh muscles tensing to rise. The magazine the thin man placed across her legs stopped her as surely as if he had just dropped a granite gravestone onto them. On the front, corpse-like and blaring close-up, the anguished face of Felicity Royal tilted upwards as if appealing to the word peep, burned blockily across the top in lurid tabloid red. Felicity's slender neck drew the reader's eyes down to the bold white capitals of the headline, Royal Agony. The thin man leaned in close, his scentless breath tickling Katie's cheek.
Now that is simply going to leap off the shelves, don't you think?
He sat back, and Katie could feel his eyes on her.
Good work, Katie.
She felt relieved when sudden anger extinguished her fear. She turned on him. What the fuck is this? Are you some kind of sick stalker or something? The thin man merely smiled at her. Do you work for the Royals? Some kind of private detective? She waved the magazine in his face and almost shouted. This is next month's edition. It's not even out yet. How did you get this? Maddeningly, The thin man merely straightened his tie and replied calmly,
Let's just call it a special edition. Advance copy. I don't see why you're so upset. It's a splendid piece of work. Why don't you calm down and turn to page 3?
What? You listen to me, you...
It's a beautiful photograph.
He interrupted smoothly.
But then you already know that, of course. Go on, enjoy the fruits of your labours.
You work at Peep, don't you? Or you know someone there? Someone who got you a copy? Katie tried to hold on to her anger and the strength it had given her, but felt it slipping away, and she didn't resist when the thin man slipped the magazine from her hands. When she looked up, he was holding open a double-page spread. The headline ran, "The Pain and Grief of a Star," above her photograph. Undeniably beautiful, but now awful in that beauty. A very public window into a private moment. Katie imagined people uttering mock sympathy as they bought it along with their cigarettes and chocolate, women chatting about the tragedy as they waited for their hair to dry in salons, social media sites discussing what the widow was wearing and whether her jewellery complemented her dress and shoes. Then someone else would die or become pregnant or get married or divorced or just fall out of a taxi drunk, and Felicity Royal's endless pain would be binned and forgotten. Katie felt sick and claustrophobic and leaned back, trying to see the sky through the maze of branches arching over the bench. Patches and flickers of blue only increased the sense of suffocation, the trees hemming her in with her shame. The thin man stood smoothly, unrolling from the bench, tugging his suit into shape over his frame. He folded Peep and tucked it into his jacket pocket.
I have been to so many funerals in here. And over there, of course.
He gestured to the gate leading to the private section.
But the memories always fade.
He gestured at the grave he had been standing over earlier.
Like inscriptions on headstones.
Katie tried to think of something to say, to ask how he knew about her, but couldn't. The thin man sniffled the air.
Yes, summer fades and autumn waits for its turn. And here we both are. Borders, see?
He began to stroll away. Wait, it's not right, Katie shouted as a thought suddenly struck her. She jumped up from the bench as the thin man stopped. The photograph. It's the wrong one. I mean, you're in it. Keith, the editor. He said you'd be airbrushed out.
Yes, and I will be. I don't crave attention. I like to go about my business quietly.
You got hold of a copy weeks before publication, with a non-edited picture. What the hell is your business? And that wasn't a rough edition you showed me. That looked like a finished product. The thin man half turned to show her the profile and grin she knew so well.
Like I said, special edition.
Katie merely stared as he glided away, his suit dark and lopsided against the white gravel of the path, sauntering like a man half his age. Still, she watched as he went through the gates, turned left and disappeared. What the hell? She breathed and slumped back onto the bench. Her brain whirled as she tried to rationalize it all. So who was the thin man then? Convinced he had some connection to Peep, she rose, intending to drive down to the office right then and demand some answers. But the gravestone the thin man had taken such an interest in earlier caught her eye. Edna something, the cancer victim. He said he attended the funeral on a day like today. She hesitated. Go on then, you morbid cow. Go have a look, then get the hell out of this place. Perhaps she was a relation of his, she reasoned, and there'll be some clue to who he is. Just what kind of clue she didn't know, however, and supposed she was just trying to justify her grim nosiness. As she expected, despite the thin man's efforts, the inscription was mostly illegible. The lettering eroded. She looked around and saw that most of the graves were unkempt and unloved here in this older part of the cemetery. She frowned, suspicion darkening her thoughts. Peering close, she made out what must have been part of a name. Adbury. That's right, Edna Bradbury. Weather and moss had claimed most of the other writing, but when she licked her thumb and rubbed at indentations near the bottom, Katie revealed a date chiseled neatly into the granite. September 1st, 1897. Nice blue sky that day, was there, Mr. Thin Man? Bullshit. She stood up with satisfaction. I knew you were full of it, bloody old creep. Katie set off down the path with renewed purpose, and was actually smiling as she emerged from the tree shade into bright, clear sunshine. Of course, I bet he saw my name as photographer in the magazine. As to how he had known she would be at the cemetery, she still didn't know, but supposed vaguely that he would expect her to revisit the scene of the crime, as her mind put it without thinking, and returning guilt watered down her satisfaction. How he knew she'd be here today, well, it could have been sheer luck, or to hell with that for now. Just get to the office. She nodded, convinced, and clanged the iron gate shut behind her. That bloody editor or someone has got some talking to do. Despite the pinch of chill in the air, bored at sea, Katie wound the window down to let some welcome breeze into the car. She hadn't decided what to do once she knew who the Thin Man was, but for now knowing would be enough. She took a left off the main road onto a residential street to avoid the lights at the crossroad junction, and immediately regretted the decision when the car she had been following suddenly stopped. Bloody idiot! I nearly went into the back of you! She shouted out of the window, then immediately pulled her head back in when she saw what the reason was. She barked out a hard laugh. What? Unbelievable. A funeral procession of a hearse and dozens of mourners slowly made their way up the street. What is it about funerals at the moment? She thought, but didn't speak out loud, for a deep, delicate quiet enveloped the scene, with only the thrumming of the hearse's engine and the occasional scrape of a shoe breaking what would have been utter silence. The lights of the car in front went out, and Katie turned her own engine off as a mark of respect. Local residents peered out of bedroom windows or came to their gates to watch, and Katie remembered herself before an automatic frown of disapproval formed on her face. Your days of being a hypocrite have long gone, I'm afraid. Better get used to a lifetime of not judging. The hearse, long and gleaming, glided past, the driver's face impassive beneath his peaked hat. Katie closed her window as the coffin, polished and new behind flawless glass, drew level with her car. White carnations spelled out, Grandma. Then the mourners drifted by, obviously a family, with adults and children huddled together, heads bowed. Many others followed a few steps behind, couples linking arms, men with awkward hands clasped behind their backs. The sense of loss ached in the air as the procession snaked towards the cemetery. Katie, not wanting to look but not knowing what else to do, thought about what the Thin Man had said about funerals being where death and life meet for a while. She glanced up at the cold, clear sky, especially at a time like this, at the edge of another season. The last of the mourners drifted by, but none looked her way. Car engines starting up broke the spell, and Katie sat up straight, took in a big breath, and turned the key in the ignition. The car in front pulled away, and she turned the wheel to follow, glancing in the rearview mirror as she set off. What? The lopsided suit, creased in the wrong places, the white hair combed back. Him! She almost stalled, the car juddering, recovered and looked again. At the back of the procession, appearing for all of the world like he belonged there, the Thin Man sauntered after the hearse. He didn't look her way. Bastard! She almost screamed, overcome with a fury she couldn't fully explain. His words came back to her.
I have been to so many funerals.
But how did he get here that fast? He did leave before me. Must have known about the funeral, driven here, then slipped into the procession. She remembered a small girl in a dark grey dress, a grandchild probably, sucking her thumb, bewildered, carried by a weeping woman. She banged the steering wheel. Sick bastard! You and me, we are nothing alike, you parasite! All Katie could think about was getting to Peep's office and finding out just who the Thin Man was once and for all. She sped away and quickly caught the car in front. How about I photograph you again, thin man, expose you in your own center page spread, wipe that bloody smile off your face? Teeth gritted, she eased off the accelerator, cursing the slowness of the traffic. In the near distance, a traffic light showed amber, and she urged the car in front to get through before it changed to red. She realized that in her anger, she had blindly turned back onto the main road, and was at the crossroads junction she had wanted to avoid in the first place. Damn it! This is the day from hell. Just let me get to that office. With maddening inevitability, the traffic light flipped to red just after the car in front squeezed through. Katie slowed, then cursed loudly and planted her foot on the accelerator. She just had enough time to register the protesting growl of her engine and the blaring of a horn before a bus loomed like a titan and smashed into her. The world boomed, jerked madly, then whirled as Katie's car crumpled in the bus's jaws, scraped sideways, then flipped onto its roof. In seconds, the scream of the bus's brakes and the squealing grind of metal on tarmac tightened into a single thin, high note of pain. Katie moaned as the upside-down world grayed around her before the sharp, coppery stink of blood snapped her back. The seatbelt felt like a band of fire across her chest, and she panicked when she could only manage to inhale a faint whistle of breath. Dimly, she realized the pain needling through her body stopped at her waist. She bent her head up, trying to look at her legs, but they were lost in a tangle of metal, and her neck exploded in agony. Her arms, sleeved in blood, dangled down against the roof, and she started to cry when she couldn't make the move. She started to grey out again. The sound of her name was like a lifeline reaching out to her through the gathering darkness, and blarily she caught onto it, trying to hold on.
Come on, Katie. Open your eyes.
Her eyelids, feeling raw and fleshy and so heavy, slowly lifted open, and she squinted.
Open your eyes.
The voice came from the passenger's window, where a figure kneeled, silhouetted against the sharp glitter of daylight. The brightness hurt her eyes, but Katie strained to see, clinging to the voice.
Come on, Katie.
He knows my name, she thought dreamily. She blinked, willing herself to focus. Details started to sharpen out of the blur of light, her reeling brain trying to reassemble the upside-down elements into an image. White hair, a lopsided dark suit, a smile she knew so well. No, please, no. She tried to turn away, but metal bit into bone and skin, and she nearly passed out again.
Don't you worry, Katie,
he said as she began to sob.
I will be there.